Welcome to Driving Alpha, where we feature our friends, the outperforming investors who demonstrate their path to driving alpha or outsized investment returns. We're Alpha Partners, where we partner with 1,000 early-stage venture firms as their opportunity capital to invest in their best companies. Driving Alpha is supported by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity knows. Learn more at affinity.co/driving alpha.
Hi, this is Brian Smiga of Driving Alpha. I'm here today with Amit Patel. Amit is the managing director at Owl Ventures, which is the largest education technology venture capital fund in the world. Welcome, Amit.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Really appreciate you having me here today.
So right off the bat, since we're a New York firm, although we invest globally, you have a New York history. And maybe we can start with that, and then we'll get into the history and the origin story of Owl. Tell us about your stint in New York.
So I think what you might be referring to is, I would say, the circuitous path that I took through college, where I took some time off from Rice University, which is where I originally started my college journey. And I actually came to New York City to pursue, studying film for, call it about 3.5 years or so. And so I had the chance to actually attend the New York Conservatory for Dramatic Arts as well as NYU. And I would say the best thing that came out of my time there was I had the chance to meet my wife, who I have now been married to for 14 years. So that was certainly the best thing that came out of my time studying film.
Well, little known secret about me, and I haven't put it in my LinkedIn yet, is I was both a SAG and Actors Equity actor in New York when I got out of school. But you and I are the only ones in venture, I think, other than Ashton Kutcher.
There you go. There you go. I will say I am still a proud SAG member myself. So
That's great. That's great. Well, now on to Owl. 2014, after, building a couple companies as an entrepreneur, being of service in New York in the education space, part of the team that started Owl, and it's been a great 10-year run. So can you share with us a little bit that origin story of starting Owl?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think on some days it's hard to believe that it's been 10 years because things have gone by so quickly. And then, as I'm sure you can appreciate, like kind of actually, the journey of kind of starting a fund and everything like that. You can also be like, wow, it has been 10 years. And so we had a really exciting event that we actually did this summer where, we recently had the chance to open up our London office and set up a presence for ourselves in Europe. And we had an event for our Europe-based CEOs as well as some of our LPs over there. And that was a really just, I think, fun milestone for us to kind of reflect on the fact that, wow, it has been a 10-year journey that we've been on. But kind of getting to your question in terms of, that origin story and kind of maybe some of the insight that led to the formation of Owl, there were a few interesting factors that were happening kind of during the last decade and at the beginning of this century, which basically had to do with, largely the infrastructure that actually existed that allowed education technology companies to scale. And what I mean by that is if you go back to 2010 and you look at, let's say, the US K-12 sector, less than 10% of K-12 schools in the US had access to high-speed broadband internet. And you kind of fast forward to where we are today, and nearly 100% of schools in the US K-12 sector have access to high-speed broadband internet. Similarly, you had the introduction of devices like the Chromebook, which made it actually affordable for schools to, purchase these devices or actually have, kind of a 1-to-1 student to device ratio. Now, that number isn't quite as ubiquitous as like kind of high-speed broadband internet access is today. But it is quickly becoming kind of, 100% of students will soon have access to devices on a one-on-one basis as well. And so for us, what we kind of saw was this trend that was happening. And one of the other factors was the policy was shifting in a pretty significant way as well, too. And, under the Obama administration at that time, E-rate funding was actually opening up to be leveraged so that schools could actually use that funding to access high-speed broadband internet, to actually purchase some of this equipment like devices so that students could actually, utilize the software and access the software. And so having that infrastructure actually start to come online made it possible to actually start to build and scale these education technology companies in a way that frankly had not been possible before. And so kind of seeing that, opportunity come to market was, one of the biggest reasons why we were really excited about starting out at that time, and kind of what made it different to kind of finally be able to scale these education technology companies in a way that was not possible.
You must have been very excited. How do you and the founding team get on the same page around those 4 pillars that represented a growth opportunity?
Yeah, so I think one of the other things is, we have had the fortune of having a variety of perspectives that the OWL team has brought to the table. And what I mean by that is if you look at like kind of where our team has actually come from, I have one of my partners who he had been doing, kind of education investment work at another fund. And so had seen kind of firsthand through that work, kind of the impacts that education technology was actually having on schools, and now why companies were actually being able to scale in a way that had not, kind of been possible before. Another one of my partners kind of had come from more of the LP world and kind of had seen, the potential that had existed in ed tech, had also seen like kind of how great firms had been built in the past and kind of why other firms that might have been successful were no longer successful. And so had that lens that kind of came and brought to the table. Another one of our partners, she had been like kind of a CFO with a lot of experience again in the venture world. So again, had seen kind of how to build the operation side of a venture firm. And then myself, I was bringing to the table the fact that, I had an operating background and kind of experience as well, both in terms of education companies, as well as having worked within schools itself. During my, I would say, second time living in New York City, I actually had the chance to work at Success Academy Charter Schools in New York, which you may know has, I believe, around like 40 schools now in New York City. And so I'd been like kind of the customer that a lot of these companies were selling to. I had the chance to buy, build, and deploy education technology solutions, including some of the companies that we actually ended up investing in out of Fund 1.
So now you have these ingredients, broadband, low-cost devices, some funding and policy changes, and maybe also the consumerization of using the web, which flowed down to the teachers and the learners themselves and their parents. From there, what's interesting to me about your portfolio and the many unicorns you've created and the great exits you've created is how global your companies are, both in where they originated and then their footprint. So can you kind of tell that story? Because that seems to be another edge that OWL possesses.
Yeah, no, fantastic question and great observation. And I think this is something that, what I would say is like became more and more obvious to us as kind of OWL started to take a look at companies, make investments and so forth, which was this desire or need for high quality education wasn't limited to like a certain part of the world. It is a universal, it's a global like desire that exists. And so therefore the innovation that was actually going to deliver kind of that high quality education or efficacious products was actually going to happen from across the world itself. And especially starting to take into consideration the local nuances, which are very, very important when it comes to the education sector. It was, again, going to happen from that kind of local entrepreneurial perspective. And so as a result, we actually saw really interesting opportunities, definitely here within the US, but we started seeing some interesting opportunities in Asia, in Europe. And I mentioned at the beginning, kind of we recently actually opened up an office in Europe because now we've made several investments over there and wanted to actually have folks that are on the ground there and there in person. And so for us, what we started to discover was the talent that was flowing into this sector, both from a founding perspective, as well as from an executive leadership perspective, just got better and better every single year. And it was amazing to see kind of who was actually being attracted and the fact that they were coming from the education sector, as well as like kind of from the general technology sector. And you were seeing these really amazing teams start to come together, as you said, kind of start to create really magical products for teachers, for students, for young learners, for adult learners. And, I talked about like kind of some of the trends that we were seeing that were really applicable to the K-12 sector. But similarly, there were other trends that kind of we were seeing happen for adult learners as well, too, right? One of the trends, as an example, is this idea basically that, somehow you're going to be done with formal education at 18, maybe if you're just doing high school, or 22 if you're doing college, maybe 26 if you're taking some type of circuitous path like I did in college, or, let's say maybe late 20s or early 30s if you're doing grad school. Like, that's just fundamentally not the world that we live in anymore, right? Like, the global economy that we live in is moving so quickly. The digital nature of everything that's happening, and we can always talk about AI at some point if we want to, but like, that is resulting in a world where people are going to consistently have to get upskilled or reskilled and really think about kind of continuing education or lifelong learning. And so, today, if you look at actually the higher education sector, there are more what we call non-traditional students in higher education than traditional students. So it is that like kind of 20 or 30 or 40-year-old who has a family, who has kids, who might be working a job and is starting to think about, well, what is my second or third career going to be? Because if I'm actually going to work for, 30, 40 or 50 years, depending on how long folks are working for, like, I am going to have to kind of upskill and reskill myself to kind of continue to remain competitive in this global economy.
So how did you take advantage of some of the opportunities that were originated in Singapore or India in particular? And did they have I'm guessing that they had certain attributes like a clean slate and maybe a greater need, and maybe a student and parent population that were very determined to learn and advance. So what were the ingredients to being so global when you were earlier, when you were smaller? Because, it just shows up in your portfolio again and again. Your companies have been started all over the world. Here you are in Silicon Valley, and now you're also in London. And then you have so many companies that have gone global. What other secrets are there?
So I think it's a combination of things. So one is like kind of our philosophy at OWL, like kind of from day one, has been to create a purpose-built education or a purpose-built organization that's focused on the education sector, right? And so what I mean by that is everything from like kind of top to bottom that we've like designed at the firm is really focused on how do we help the world's leading like education technology companies scale. And so we are very focused on things such as like the distribution partnerships that our companies can get access to, or the content partnerships that our companies can get access to. What are the, amazing executive talent that they should be considering kind of bringing on board to really help, kind of with the next chapter of scaling that company or the next chapter of product development within that company. Similarly, we brought on board one of our partners, Malvika, who is explicitly focused on, helping our companies think about measuring outcomes and efficacy, because we believe that, the companies that are going to be the longest lasting or the most valuable in the sector are the ones that are going to deliver some type of learning outcome. And then, kind of we've developed a deep network of kind of helping our companies think about downstream capital as well, and kind of how to benchmark themselves and how to kind of continue to be able to have access to that. And so, these are just a few examples of how we've thought about like actually creating, like I said, that purpose-built organization for helping scale these ed tech companies. And so as we started to build out OWL, as our companies here in the US started to get to scale and enter into other markets and think about, okay, well, how do we expand from the US to Europe, or how do we expand from the US to, other parts of the world? We were helping them do that work. Simultaneous to that, our fund was attracting LPs, not only from the US, but also with like kind of an international base as well too. And so as our companies were thinking about expanding to those countries, we also had, help from our LPs who, were helping them think about, okay, well, how should I be thinking about expanding to Europe, or how should I be thinking about expanding to Asia or Latin America? And so through that natural work that we were doing, because we tend to be, kind of real thought partners to our entrepreneurs, we started to get to know those local ecosystems in what I would say in a really organic way, both founders as well as investors. And so that naturally led to kind of introductions and developments of relationships of companies that were, looking at that local market itself, or companies in that market that were saying, hey, you know what? The reality of the situation is like, we want to come to the US and we would like to partner with you to help us think about how to enter that market. And so it was a combination and confluence of all those events that actually led to us kind of starting to create these relationships, identifying those investments, and then starting to make those international investments as well too.
So let's talk about outcomes, because you brought it up and it seems very central to the way you're building these companies. In our world, we're always looking at the customer ROI, whether it's consumer or enterprise, and it should be an economic equation, easy to understand. In education tech, How early do you really start thinking about efficacy and outcomes? And maybe share with a general audience just what a great opportunity there is to create outcomes using technology in education.
So we would say, I think like companies should start thinking about it from day one, right? And I think the reason why we believe that is because if you don't actually have like a strong fundamental focus on this, it's difficult, like kind of once you get to scale to like develop that in a way that it's really a part of the culture of the company. And so that was one of the biggest motivating factors why we did bring kind of a full-time person that I mentioned before, our partner Malvika, onto the team so that, kind of not only were we helping our companies post-investment think about this, but we were actually having Malvika help us look at companies pre-making the investment in the company to say, hey, how do we feel about kind of what this company is doing when it comes to thinking about outcomes and efficacy measurement, or what's their thesis around it? Now, I do think that there are stages of maturity when it comes to early stage companies versus later stage companies. And so we do, kind of work with our companies to make sure that we are being thoughtful in how they can practically do this. So at the earlier stages, it does tend to be, let's say, more qualitative in nature. You're talking about, serving teachers, serving students, rapidly, like kind of incorporating that into product development and so forth. And then once you have a certain level of maturity and scale to your product, I think you can get much more quantitative in nature. And so that's when you can start to do like kind of third-party efficacy studies, and you can start to do things like randomized controlled trials and so forth. And so, there is that spectrum that exists, and our companies we help them think through, how they should kind of make progress on that spectrum. And then actually every year we actually produce what we call our education outcomes report, which is a report that highlights how each of our companies are actually thinking about this, where they are on that journey, and then includes some case studies in terms of what is the impact on outcomes and efficacy that they are actually having.
So do you make that only available to your LPs, or can we send our audience to read it?
No, it's right there on our website. If you go on our website, and there's a link right there at the top. And so, yeah, definitely encourage everyone to take a look at it and, kind of see what our companies are doing when it comes to outcomes and efficacy.
So if you're an EdTech entrepreneur, I think we've just heard the playbook at OWL, all the ways they help you scale and adjudicate your business model. And maybe the best place to start is to read that outcomes report and then send in a business plan.
That sounds great. And that's the perfect recommendation, Brian.
Now let's help them a little bit more. When you've been the funder of some really great companies, what is it you look for in a raw startup that's coming to you? How early do you invest? And are there any key ingredients or key cultural capabilities or other things that you look for in that very, very early stage team or company?
I would say there's probably like three overarching categories that we kind of evaluate an investment from. So we are stage agnostic. So we're looking at early stage as well as later stage. So in that first category, we understand that there might be limited data, especially with the early stages, but obviously with later stages, there might be more data analyzed. Like what we are interested in is if there is historical data associated with the company, what does that kind of look like? What have growth rates look like? What do like unit economics look like? What are the fundamentals of the business? Kind of how does this company think about long-term competitive advantages, and how does that fit in with kind of building that world-class leading education technology platform, which is fundamentally the goal of what we're trying to invest in. And so we are analyzing that from all of those perspectives to kind of arrive at a point of view on that. And so that's bucket number one in terms of what we're trying to evaluate. I'd say bucket number two is the people, right? And I kind of highlighted the fact that like one of the things that we have, deeply appreciated about like kind of our journey at OWL is not only the people that we've been able to recruit to join the team, but also the people that have, founded the companies that we're investing in, as well as the executives and the general team that have come to work at the portfolio companies. And we believe in this being long-term partnerships. Kind of, we're not in the, the business of like kind of funding ideas, but not investing in the people that are also kind of starting those ideas. And so for us, we want to be excited about the team as well as the idea. And we also want that team to be excited to work with us as well and view it very much, again, as a long-term partnership. So that's the second bucket that we look at and kind of evaluate opportunities from. And the third bucket is what I was alluding to before, which was that outcomes and efficacy, which is just, hey, is there a real belief here, either that's been shown in research, in practice, or, kind of our understanding of what best-in-class content, assessment, or pedagogy looks like, that this is is a company that will have kind of some positive impact when it comes to learner outcomes or educator goals or so forth.
So when you create these outcomes, and you recognize these teams and founders, is there an exemplar you might want to point to? I think it's okay to name a founder's name and a company, but like, okay, they had these 3 pillars and they delivered. And anyway, maybe we can unpack it through an example.
Maybe the company that I would like potentially point to that comes to mind is Amira Learning, which is a company in our portfolio that's focused on helping students with oral reading fluency. And so you, Brian, and your audience may be familiar with this statistic, which is, kind of there's this huge kind of push to have like kind of students being able to read on grade level by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade. And that's because what happens in the kind of K-12 system is that's around the time that you make the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And so if kind of a student has not, learned to read by that time, it becomes even more difficult to learn anything else that they're going to engage with, especially from a reading content perspective. And so actually, if a student is not reading on grade level by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade, they're statistically unlikely to be reading on grade level by the time they graduate from high school, because kind of this problem just compounds on itself. And so Amira, which is a company that was founded by Mark Angel, who was the former CTO of Renaissance Learning, an extremely, large scale and very successful education technology company, and had been a CEO multiple times. I would say, first of all, kind of in bucket number 1 is a very early stage company. So, there's limited data to go on, but like I would say the solution that they were bringing out to market was, in our opinion, kind of 10x better than what existed out there today. So, that long-term competitive advantage I was talking about, like definitely existed. I think second, if you talk to administrators or educators and you kind of said, hey, tell me what are some of the biggest problems that you're kind of facing, you'd probably be hard pressed to find somebody that didn't have this specific issue of helping students, reading on grade level, especially in elementary school, as like not being named, right? Like this is one of the biggest issues that's not only facing us in the US here, but is a global issue that kind of is one that needs to be solved. And so like kind of the need for something like this was huge. And so, kind of, I'd say like kind of from bucket number 1, those were some of the elements that got us really excited. I think from bucket number 2 of the team, Mark, as well as like kind of his co-founder, Pete, who had worked with him for a long time at Renaissance, as well as some of the other executives that he had already been able to bring on board. Again, really deeply understood this market. They had seen scale. They brought like kind of not only the education side of understanding how to build something, but also the technical side of how to build something. And so really brought that complementary skill set. And then third, the technology that they were building a lot of this based on had been shown in academic research at, Carnegie Mellon, at Johns Hopkins, at UCLA, and several other universities to actually have like profound impact on, kind of student outcomes and learner outcomes. And so, kind of, you can kind of see how these pieces of those 3 buckets that I was talking about are kind of falling into place, and why we got really excited about working with Mark and the team. And I would say it's just been an absolutely amazing journey so far. And we're kind of really excited about the path ahead for Amira Learning and kind of what they're doing. And, now they're working with thousands of districts across the country. They're also kind of launching pilots in, I think close to 17 countries around the world as well too. And so it's just been a really exciting journey to partner with them.
There you have it, a 10x defensible difference in a very, very large market, solving a very big problem. Now we get to the question everybody in the room has, including the educators on the line: AI in education. Does it the new catalysts, such as the 4 catalysts you had back in 2014 when you started?
Yeah. So I think AI and the intersection of education is, I think there's profound potential there. And, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about this. You've heard even Sam, at OpenAI, you've heard Sal at Khan Academy talk about this. And, I think there's been a number of our companies actually from Fund 1 that have actually been working on, the integration point of education and AI. Now, it didn't necessarily take the form of generative AI, which is like obviously what everybody's talking about today. But if you start to think about some of the, kind of key ingredients of AI, which is like natural language processing and machine learning, these are things that actually like several of our Fund 1 companies, including Quizlet, which was one of the like featured partners with OpenAI when they first released, kind of what was actually possible with generative AI. Quizlet was using kind of since we made the investment in the company. Similarly, we had another company called Securely, which was, monitoring online student safety as they were interacting with websites and things like that. So again, leveraged a lot of those kind of core components of AI. Again, it wasn't as obvious, I would say, to the end user because a lot of that was happening like kind of on the back end. And again, it wasn't in this interface where, kind of the user themselves was interfacing with the AI itself. And so that intersection, has existed for a long time. Amira Learning, the company that we just talked about, also sat at that intersection. But I would say on a go-forward basis, we are also very excited about now actually what is possible at this intersection. And to bring it to life, what I mean by that is, if you think about, let's take a concept like personalized learning, right? I'm sure a lot of you as well as the listeners to your podcast have heard about this. And, there's always been this discussion about like, oh, well, it would be really exciting if you can give each student like their actual personalized learning path. Generative AI, kind of what almost had to happen was you almost had to think about all of the different permutations or pathways that could exist. And then you were trying to say, well, based on student responses and so forth, this is the closest like personalized path that I could get them to, because this is the one that I've actually predefined. And so while it was, kind of delivering on some aspects of that personalized learning, it wasn't actually fully delivering on it. With LLMs and with generative AI, you actually don't have to have that necessarily predefined. And what can actually happen is in the moment, based on actually what that student's response is, and without certain constraints actually put on that, you can truly create like what is a personalized learning path for that student. And it's going to be a one-of-one experience and not, hey, we happen to kind of come up with like these 2,000, kind of paths. And if you fit into one of these 2,000, then great. But if you're going off road from one of these 2,000, we can't actually create a personalized learning plan. So I think that is like one of the most amazing kind of use cases that could happen with AI in education in its current format. I also think the second piece I would say is, I think the amount of expectations that we have on kind of educators and teachers has just kind of continued to increase, right? And, I think, we now fundamentally believe that like kind of teachers are going to be like kind of one of the central roles that continues to play a significant role when it comes to kind of educating students, especially when it comes to educating young students, right? Because, it's not just about, memorizing facts or things like that. You're talking about like kind of learning how to interact with another human being. You're starting to learn emotional intelligence. Like there's a whole lot of things that kind of are incorporated in education outside of, did you get an A on this test, right? Or did you, kind of memorize these facts? And so for us, there's a huge potential where AI can be quite helpful in helping educators, especially with repetitive tasks, and really focusing on those one-on-one interactions or those small group interactions, which again, that's what's been shown in like kind of the research as having the biggest impact on student outcomes. Is if you can actually have much more of those interactions, that's going to result in much better outcome for students. And so that's another example of what we think is like kind of really exciting and possible with AI and EdTech.
I can tell you're really excited about how AI is going to create more wealth and create more opportunity and more outcomes. You're really excited. So do you ever get emotional about some of these outcomes? I mean, I think you probably might when you see kids being able to read at a higher grade level or meeting grade level. Does it ever get emotional at your annual meeting or anything like that?
100%, I would say. I think and again, this is some of what we highlight like kind of in our education outcomes report is like the direct impact that kind of our companies are having on student outcomes. And, I think there's been, all kinds of emotional moments. Like I can think about, one of our companies, Splash Learn, when COVID was happening, we had several, dozen teachers send in a video to the founders of Splash Learn, kind of just deeply thanking them for kind of continuing to provide their product for teachers as well as for schools, especially during that time when it was such a critical piece of like kind of infrastructure that was necessary to kind of continue to educate students. You could see like the emotion that was there. And it was just heartwarming to kind of see that. And then, I would say in cases like Securely, where, you are thinking about things like cyberbullying or students having suicidal thoughts or, kind of somebody thinking about potentially, committing an act of violence. Like there are literally lives that were saved there, right? We have another company, Hazel Health, in our portfolio, which is bringing telemedicine services to the K-12 sector, which again, there are literally lives that are saved there. And so it's absolutely incredible. And, I consider it a privilege and an honor to kind of be a part of this team at Owl. And
Okay, I saved two short answer questions for the end. This one relates to what we just talked about, and I'm getting emotional. It's such a great outcomes here as a dad, and you must feel that way as a parent and a former educator. For the LPs and investors and institutions looking at this space, is it double outcome? Is it absolute return? Is it both? How do you see it? Can you generate the kind of venture returns that others are trying to do?
We fundamentally do believe so, that is absolutely possible in this category. And, I think the point that, kind of maybe my illustrator may come to life is here, let's take, again, the US as an example. If you are not working with the largest school districts in urban centers, it is impossible to create a scaled enough company. And so for us, what we are looking for are the companies that are actually going to be able to work with the top 100, the top 1,000 districts in the country that on average are usually serving 50% free and reduced lunch. And so that is fundamental to what we believe is necessary.
And the proof is in the pudding. Just look at your portfolio and the number of IPOs, acquisitions, unicorns, exits. Fantastic. And so the last question, out of your alma mater, NYU, are you the Spike Lee of EdTech or are you the Martin Scorsese of EdTech?
That is a hard choice to make. If I could say, I would be honored to be considered either of them, but definitely don't feel qualified to claim myself to be either one of them. So.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Amit. This has been Brian Smiga, co-founder at Alpha Partners, here on the podcast Seeking Alpha, Driving Alpha, with Amit Patel of Owl Ventures. Be sure to read that study on his website, Owl Ventures, owlvc.com. Thanks all.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Driving Alpha podcast, where we host top investors to demonstrate how they outperform the market. Click subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Driving Alpha is supported by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity knows. Learn more at affinity.co/driving alpha.